Good evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones. Joining us tonight, renowned neuroscientist Susan Greenfield, who believes pervasive digital technology is rewiring our brains. The Shadow Minister for Infrastructure, Anthony Albanese. The Deputy Director of the Institute of Public Affairs, James Paterson. Australia's Youth Representative to the United Nations, Laura John. And the Environment Minister, Greg Hunt. Please welcome our panel. So, Q&A is simulcast on ABC News 24, News Radio and Australia Plus, and you can join the Twitter conversation using the Quanda hashtag as usual. And if you've got a live question for us, add @Quanda to help us find it. Well, our Facebook followers want to discuss the renewable energy target, technology's impact on our brains, and what motivates the young to get involved in politics. And our first question tonight comes from Dominic Wilcox.
Baroness Greenfield. I'm going to ask you perhaps to set a personal argument I'm having with my mother. She's a big fan of yours, and she...
And you disagree with her, obviously.
Yes, of course, on that count. She believes that... she's very worried that technology and social media is affecting her mostly adult children in very negative ways, and she thinks something needs to be done to stop this. I tell her that there's really nothing we can do, and that older people like her simply need to adapt to this brave new world. So is she right, or am I?
OK, so how long have we got? Someone once said someone said for every complex situation there's always a simple answer, and it's always wrong. And I think this is a really complex situation, and I think we can unpack your question first of all in two ways. First thing you said is there's nothing that can be done. But that's different from there's nothing that should be done, yeah? So let's take it that there's something that should be done rather than that we're all just, hopeless cases and, we should just sleepwalk into something we don't want. Let's say that you actually enjoy your current lifestyle and you're asking me now to join forces with your mum and try and convince you that there are issues. I think the first thing is that technology isn't, like most things, wholly good or wholly bad. It's like saying, is a car good or bad? But what we need to explore is the lifestyle that technology is giving many people when you could wake up in the morning and you could go shopping, you could work, you could play games, you could go dating, all without seeing another human being for the whole day. And that's why I argue this technology is creating an environment that's different from the technological impact of past inventions and the environments that they created.
But Susan, at the end of that tragic day, he gets to come to the Q&A audience.
He does.
Sit among real people and ask questions on a television program. So it can't be all bad for Dominic.
Well, he could ask any question he liked. But anyway,
can I just interrupt you for a second? I mean, you say the science shows that digital natives like Dominic have massive and unprecedented differences in the way their brains operate to the way previous generations operate.
Well, let me just clarify something, in that living changes your brain. Every moment you're alive, whether you're born in 5th century Athens or Sydney or England or 30 years ago, whatever you do, since you've been here, your brains have changed in the few minutes even that everyone's brains have changed. So, because experience leaves its mark on your brain irrespective. It's our evolutionary mandate. It's why we occupy more niches than any other species on the planet. Yeah? So, given that, this so-called plasticity of the brain, what we must explore is how it's different. It's not that it's rewiring your brain and nothing else does. Everything rewires your brain. It's more, this could be rewiring your brain in a different way. In a
negative way?
Both possible. Well, it depends on what your values are and how you judge. I wouldn't want to say things were positive or negative. What I would like to say is these are the facts and we should discuss them, because it's by discussing them that we have a healthy society where we can then say what we want. Because it's all very well to say what you don't want, and to, like, your mum might say what she doesn't want, but I'd like to ask your mum, Dominic, what she wants. What would her ideal son be? What would the ideal lifestyle be?
Let's go to Dominic. What is it about your lifestyle that your mother is worried about, Dominic?
One who visits her more.
Yeah.
Does she think you're spending too much time behind a computer screen?
Not me personally, but certainly some of my younger siblings, I think she's, and I'm probably embarrassing them if they're watching this, she's a bit concerned about.
Yeah, because the issue is, and the basic question is, what do we want out of life? Your younger siblings, indeed you yourself, and perhaps let's hope even some of us older folk, have a 1 in 3 chance of living to be 100, OK? So what are you going to do for the second 50 years of your life?
Well, you might spend a lot of time online
Are you just going to be
talking to other people.
glassy-eyed?
Let's hear from some of our younger panellists first. Yeah. James, are you worried that you may be rewiring your brain, or are you not a digital native? Do you still use a quill?
Look, I
don't know how the IPA operates.
I guess I could be a victim of it without knowing about it, but my experience and what I observe in my peers is that technology has been an overwhelmingly positive thing in our lives, and I think it's an ambiguous positive. We communicate more, we're connected more, there are more opportunities for us to get in touch with each other. It's not as good to be communicating on Skype as it is in person, obviously, but for some people that's the only option, and if you're away from your family or friends or loved ones, we've got so many more opportunities to communicate than we did before, and I think that's a great thing.
Why do you want to be connected all the time, James?
Because human interaction's a wonderful thing, and we can learn from other people.
Let me just challenge you on that. If you're constantly inputting and constantly outputting, rather like I was at some breakfast where Nick Clegg, our Deputy Prime Minister, was, and there was a lady so busy tweeting to everyone, she was being connected, having breakfast with Nick Clegg, she wasn't listening to actually what he was saying. Yeah? And what I fear, if you're connected, interacting all the time, that lots coming in, a lot's going out very efficiently, but the middle bit, the thinking bit, where you think, hang on, if that, then that, but if that, then that, but hang on, what about that? And you're embedding something, that's what thinking is, into a bigger framework. And surely that's what knowledge is and learning as opposed to information processing. And whilst it sounds good to be hyper-connected and to be outputting all the time, I think we should just question whether that premise is correct.
Yes, you can, Laura.
If I could just jump in here, as a digital native myself, I actually think I'm very good at tweeting and listening at the same time, and I think you'll find that a lot of young people have actually been able to gather this skill where we're able to tweet and also listen.
But a paper has just come out, and this is a peer-reviewed science paper, that multitasking has a deleterious effect on brain scans. It shows atrophy in a smaller brain region. So it might sound good and be good to multitask. Again, it begs the question, like with Dominic, what do you want? What do you want? You know? Now, if you want to be cool and trendy and connected, go right ahead, that's fine. But if what you want is to have a new idea or to digest some thoughts or to let things tick off against other boxes and so on, then it's not good. But it's not as if we have the choice.
I'm just going to go. A lot of people want to talk about this, and I'm going to bring Laura back to give her a chance to answer whether she thinks multitasking somehow limits your brain.
Well, I'd like to think it doesn't, because I certainly spend a lot of my time multitasking. And I think you've made some really interesting and valid points, Susan. What I found in my personal experience with technology is that it does indeed make people feel more connected. And I think one of the really positive things about technology that needs to be mentioned here is that it's really able to build a movement of people who empathise with each other, even if we're not physically in front of each other.
OK, well, there's two things there. Again,
Susan, I'm going to interrupt. I'll come back to your two things. I want to hear from the other panellists, though. Anthony Albanese's dying to get in here because he's a digital native, isn't he?
I wouldn't go that far, but I think technology is overwhelmingly liberating and good for the economy and good for interaction. But I think that the points that Susan raises are really valid. As a parent, let me tell you, there's a lot of conversations around the P&C in the schoolyard about should kids be limited in terms of how long they look at, play Xbox or what have you. There's a there are health consequences as well behind kids sitting in computers and not getting out down the park like we used to before those things were available. And I think in terms of quality, I went to a Morrissey concert, to make you feel comfortable, at
we're the same age.
Last year, absolutely. And there was someone in front of me watching the concert, not watching Morrissey and the band, but watching the digital device where they were recording it. And were I not a politician, I might have tapped her on the shoulder and said, what are you doing? You're not enjoying the moment. There's an element of... there's a great episode of Modern Family where they're all sitting around the kitchen and they're tweeting each other and texting each other rather than talking to each other.
Unlike you watching old media TV.
Well, I think there's a reason why the audience are here rather than watching it.
So what would your parliament be like
if
you weren't
social
making
interaction.
Speeches? Can you imagine your parliament? if you were actually having debates by
actually,
texting
have you
and
seen
tweeting.
the Parliament? The truth is,
Can I make my 2 points?
a lot of people do spend a lot of time looking at their iPhones, I've noticed.
Yeah, can I make my 2 points?
Yes,
please,
you
because I
can.
had to write them down.
I'd like to get Greg Hunt to make one, though. So
Oh, no,
go ahead.
okay, no, I've written them down. I borrowed
Okay,
his
no,
pen.
go ahead, go on.
So the first is the connected issue. One could argue by being connected, that's how you're defining yourself, and that therefore your identity is now being constructed externally for the approval. I wouldn't even call them friends, I'd call them an audience, you know, your 500 audience on Facebook, and that this actually might undermine your sense of a robust identity. And in fact, the British government in 2013, and anyone can download this, commissioned a report called Future Identities, suggesting indeed that because of social networking, our identities were becoming more
all right, no,
volatile.
I'm going to stop you.
Second point.
No,
He does want to
save
argue
that
my
point because
Let her have her
I've got to
second
get
point.
someone.
No,
I've got to get Laura to respond to the first point.
Okay.
Are your Facebook friends diluting your identity?
I think I've got a really strong sense of identity. I mean, I've got selfies taken at different points during the day, which really highlight exactly who I am at any particular moment. No, but I understand the point that you're making, Susan. I think that perhaps for some people that would be an issue.
Indeed.
But I think it underestimates that the vast majority of young people who I've met this year in my consultations are actually able to differentiate between social media and their real life. So we understand that the people who you call our audience on social media are not necessarily our best friends. They're not the people we're going to call if we're having a tough day. So I think we do understand that distinction.
So they're not really friends when you say friend. They're just not actually real.
They're associates. They're people who we might want to connect with, but they're not your
All
best
right.
friends.
Well, hang on, hold on. You've got another point? I just want to hear from Greg Hunt because we haven't heard from him at all.
No.
And are you at all concerned that young people may be damaging their brains, or at least the way in which they interact with others?
Sure. Look, I think there are two parts. There's the social and the personal. And the personal I look at as a parent of a 9-year-old and a 5-year-old. The social, I think it's generally an overwhelming good, the fact that this program is, in a sense, a metaphor. You have people here in the audience, you've got hundreds of thousands watching on television, and then you've got those that are directly interacting with Twitter or email. From a community perspective, you can engage in a way that is sort of Athenian, where people are part of the democracy, they're part of the smaller communities. I think that's an overwhelming good, and there can be some bad sides to it. From a personal perspective, as a father watching a 5-year-old sort of tyro boy and a 9-year-old girl go through the digital age, yes, they can become obsessed. The 9-year-old, however, when she was a little bit younger, was listening to audiobooks, became, taken by Harry Potter. That really got her into reading, and suddenly it's interesting that the digital got her into the real world of books more than anything else. And for the little fella, he became a little bit obsessed for a short period of time on the iPad playing soccer games. And all of a sudden, we can't get him out of the backyard. All he wants to do is play real soccer. So it's gone in the opposite direction from the experience that people would assume. They have moved from the digital to the real world because of the exposure to the digital.
Just while I think about it, can you remind the Prime Minister that he's missing out on this Athenian possibility of coming on Q&A? We've got another question up there. You'll be able to respond to this.
Okay.
Go ahead. And the question's from Nicholas Walker.
Okay, my question is directed to the Baroness.
Call me Susan, please.
Oh,
Sounds
okay.
like something out of Alice in Wonderland.
True.
Where are you? Sorry, I can't think. Where are you?
Right here.
There. Okay. Hi.
Has social media made my generation or children narcissists, and is today's children the most narcissistic generation ever?
Thank you for that. And I see now why you said I could hold my second question, because this also answers Laura's, as you said. Thanks. What's your name? Sorry.
Nicholas.
Nicholas, thank you for that. Yeah, it's been shown that for those who are using social media to have friends, in inverted commas, who they've never met, that's the big difference. If you've never met someone, then there is an increase in narcissism and low self-esteem, which I don't think any of us would want. Yeah? And it's a rather vicious cycle. And again, this picks up also on the empathy issue, because normally when you meet someone, even you and I communicating across a thing, you're nodding nicely and smart. Well, I hope you are. But you're giving some kind of body language. Yeah. So that's nature's way of providing you with a handbrake not to divulge too much if the person, say, is folding their arms, they're looking away, they're averting their eyes. That tells you not to open up. Now, human beings have a natural tendency to talk about themselves, and there's a lovely study, and I cite it in Mind Change, where, get this, the subjects actually prefer to have, instead of monetary reward, they prefer to have the opportunity to talk about themselves.
Oh, wow.
Can you get that? They prefer that than money. Yeah. So any employers here who people want a pay rise, you could say, talk about yourself half an hour. But seriously, this means we have a natural tendency to do that. Normally that's constrained. We have the handbrake of body language, which means that you only do it under carefully constrained scenarios.
So I think you make a broader argument that not only is it narcissistic, but it means that there's a lack of empathy.
Indeed.
Human empathy.
Indeed, because very few people would actually look someone in the eye and say, go kill yourself. Or even, I hate you, because of the reaction they would get. And sadly, we know from the behaviour of trolls, and there's many examples of this, people engage in unspeakable ways of communicating. And I would like to think it's because they've devalued concepts like hate. They don't really know what hate means.
Okay,
and so on.
I mean, now I'm going to hear from our younger panellists again. Anthony Obick. No, I'm just kidding.
Thanks, Tony.
James, go ahead.
Every new technology attracts this kind of fear. Believe it or not, when the paperback novel became widely available, people were terrified that young people would get lost in them and they wouldn't interact with their friends and colleagues. The same thing happened to radio and to television, and now to the digital age. These fears often, I think, are overblown. Human beings are incredibly adaptable and resilient, and I just don't buy this fear and,
no, James,
scare that we can't handle.
The analogy doesn't work, because the car and the book, they existed in the real world. You lived in a three-dimensional world. They were a means to an end. This can be an end in itself. Not always, of course, for people like yourself and Laura, I'm sure. It's a means to an end. But when it's an end in itself, that's where I have concerns.
All right, let's hear James finish his point.
Yeah.
Well, I just think that, this kind of fear-mongering happens with all new technologies, and the point about them is not the particular characteristics, but that they're new. It is natural to be concerned about what the impact of something we don't know about it is. I mean,
well, they used to say that Elvis Presley would lead to a sexual revolution.
No. Yes,
actually, that did happen.
And actually, I don't think that was such a bad thing. I mean, society evolves, people change.
But
that's
James,
a positive
you're
thing.
entitled to your own views. You're not entitled to your own facts.
Okay, let's...
And the facts are, I'm afraid, that there are big changes that we're not seeing or haven't seen with the printing press.
All right, Laura, let's hear from you. This idea of narcissism, I'd like to get you to... You did talk about the number of selfies you took during the day. I know you were joking.
I was joking about the selfies.
Yes,
but I think, as I've said before, I think Susan makes some really valid points. But on the other side of this debate, there are positive things that you can do through social media that you can only do through social media. So, for example, we've got petition-based organisations like Change.org or even Amnesty International, who are actually enabling young people in particular to know about issues, empathise with issues and influence issues which are happening on the other side of the world. These are things that are not possible without technology. So I very much understand what you're saying, and I think there obviously needs to be limits on the way we use technology. That's something I would completely agree with. But let's not act like this is a completely negative, evil thing, because it's not.
I haven't said that, and I'm certainly not. Scaremongering is a very easy word to use, but one says, when is something scaremongering and when is something a wake-up call? Would you have said people in the 50s who are alerting people to the perils of smoking were scaremongering? You would not. Scaremongering is a conclusion you reach, not a premise you make.
I think we might... Have we got anyone with their hands up? I saw someone... Yes, there's a gentleman with his hand up over there. We'll quickly go to you. Go ahead.
Tony, I'm just concerned that we've got one scientist on the panel and the rest of the panel aren't. And one of the things that Susan in her book says is that the input-output processing, in fact, degrades scientific thinking. And I think we just had an example of it because Laura, in response to peer-reviewed research, responded, in my personal experience.
Exactly.
And I'm just intrigued as to whether the panel recognises that what Susan has been talking about is a thing called science and everyone else is talking about his personal experience.
Yes,
well, I realise...
Thank you.
But I'd also say this.
Thank you.
That the scientists, there are plenty of scientists who disagree with you, as you know.
Well, no.
In Britain, yes,
well, no,
that's true, because I've read several of them at least.
No, no, then...
and the other thing they say is that you don't do your own peer-reviewed research, you review other people's work.
No, well, let me just deal with that, because I think this is a misconception. When you say there's plenty of scientists, there's one or two journalists, an extreme, but on the whole, as the gentleman there said, a peer-reviewed paper is a peer-reviewed paper, irrespective of who has done it, right? Its validity stands and falls by its merits of its content, not by the authorship. In my case, when I talk about mind change, it's such an umbrella issue. It embraces disciplines ranging from molecular biology through to sociology, and no single scientist ever would do that whole range of things. Yeah? So it's a rather strange sidetracking to try and chop someone off at the knees when really we should be exploring and talking about the papers and the science. Who's done them is irrelevant. Yeah? It's, as the gentleman said, how they're discussed and debated and what they show. And again, this tendency, and I do think this is something that happens in the blogosphere, to personalise things. You know, it always has to be a personal attack or a personal view or in my opinion. And I think this in turn harkens to a greater problem of this tendency to always be self-referential. You know, this is the chocolate cake I've just eaten, you know, and downloading it. And, and this inability to sort of have general ideas. And,
well, I mean, I suppose one of the problems is that you've got two people on the panel who have lived experience of social media, and they feel, I guess, that perhaps some of the fears that you're expressing...
Greg aren't that bad.
All that old.
All that. Oh, thank you.
No, I'm talking about the digital natives, I think. So, James, you can quickly respond to that, and I'll get Laura to respond to it, then we'll move on.
Okay.
Well, I think the time will tell. Obviously, everything in moderation, and there is capacity for people to do damaging things to themselves with new technology. But I think history will show in a few years' time that this has been an overwhelmingly positive thing, it's been an overwhelmingly positive development, and that our lives have been enriched by it.
And Laura, so I mean, taking the point there that you're dealing with science, is it implacable?
Well, I think to take the point that was raised by the audience, I'm obviously not a scientist. I'm not going to stand up here and talk in terms of science because I'm not. I think the points that Susan have raised are really valid, and perhaps what we need to see is an education system that is also adapting to these newer technologies. Yep. So that's something that has come up in my consultations with young people saying, well, let's integrate the technology into our school system so that we're learning how to use it appropriately, and perhaps some of these fears that you mentioned might not eventuate.
Thank you. All I'm saying, when you say people disagree with me, what baffles me is what hypothesis they're disagreeing with, because all I'm saying is we need to look at the science, we need to have these kind of debates, which is look how animated and controversial it is. That's a healthy society, and that's what we want. And how can anyone disagree with that?
I don't think they can.
No.
Let's move back to the real world, or at least the world of politics. And our next question comes from Kevin Armstrong.
Question to Greg Hunt. Clive Palmer recently described your direct action policy as a waste of money. To get direct action through the Parliament, you cut a deal with him to retain the Climate Change Authority to undertake a study on emissions trading worldwide, as you described it, as an act of good faith, having already said that your government will never introduce an emissions trading scheme. Isn't this dodgy deal the metaphorical equivalent of painting rocks white?
No. And the reason why is very simple. What we've just done is invest $2.5 billion in reducing emissions, in helping Indigenous communities to engage in land management, to reduce emissions from savanna wildfires, to work with farmers in capturing carbon in their landscape, to work with agricultural producers in cleaning up emissions from waste methane gas from dairies and piggeries, to help energy efficiency on a grand scale. These are all the things we're investing in. Cleaning up power stations on a major basis, things which were simply not happening because the previous government was providing, I think, $5.5 billion to brown coal power stations in my home state of Victoria just to keep operating. So what we did is we set out 5 years ago and took to 2 elections that we would invest this $2.5 billion to actually clean up and reduce emissions. We weren't going to be able to abolish the Climate Change Authority, so part of what Mr Palmer asked for was, firstly, to have a study into emissions trading schemes, but also, and this tends to be overlooked, what the rest of the world is doing in terms of the lead up to Paris with regards to targets, what Australia's targets could and should be, and following the Paris conference, Paris is the major international pledging conference.
I'll tell you what, we've actually got a question, Greg. We've got a question coming up on that. So leave targets for the side. But actually,
all of those things
I just want to quickly go back to the questioner, Kevin Armstrong. Did you somehow object to this deal?
Look, it seems like a dodgy deal to me that you deal with someone who says that what you're doing is a waste of money, and yet all of a sudden he supports it. Now, there's obviously some sort of deal been done. Subsidiary question, I suppose, is direct action evidenced anywhere in the world to be successful, or is this just a hope?
Sure. The world has two primary systems. One of them is the electricity tax model, and then the other one is the incentives model. The UN Clean Development Mechanism, the largest, most successful system in the world, is based on the incentives approach. About 1 billion tonnes of emissions reductions being produced through the Clean Development Mechanism approach, where you reduce emissions by providing incentives. The other approach, which is the electricity tax approach and gas tax approach, it's sometimes known as a carbon tax or an emissions trading scheme, that's had its base in Europe. As we see, there are many people who've analysed the European system, and I'm not being critical of it, who've just looked at it and said, firms such as Point Carbon, one of the major trading firms, it's not actually reducing emissions. We've seen the United States and Canada and Japan all move away from the electricity and gas tax model. And so there are two primary systems in the world. One, a tax-based system, the other one, an incentives-based system as embodied in the UN Clean Development Mechanism, and that's what we've based our approach on.
OK, let's go to Anthony Albanese.
Well, this is bad policy. The distinction which Greg drew should be one which taxes polluters, which is what an emissions trading scheme or a market-based mechanism does, whether it's a direct fixed price in the carbon price that was there, leading to a market-based mechanism. The second is one that just gives money to the big polluters. That's Greg's scheme, $2.5 billion, and it won't work. Ross Garnaut has said that it will cost, in real terms, to meet the target, it would require about $4 billion every year. And that was backed up by Ken Henry, supported that analysis by Ross Garnaut. What worries me about the coalition isn't there are two groups. One are the climate sceptics who don't believe in climate change, don't believe it's happening, don't believe that any human activity is causing global warming. That's one thing, that's understandable. But it's even worse people like Greg, who actually knows and wrote a thesis calling for an emissions trading scheme about it.
You can't make a false statement on national television, Anthony.
Wrote a thesis.
You've just made a false statement on national television.
I did not. Wrote a thesis about
zinc,
it.
cadmium and lead, completely false statement on national television, which you should withdraw.
I will do nothing of the sort. You supported an emissions trading scheme.
You've just made a false statement.
Not just
knowingly, deliberately false.
Not just in your thesis, but in the Parliament you supported an emissions trading scheme. You and Malcolm Turnbull supported it. Tony Abbott came in and you backflipped completely on your core beliefs.
Anthony Albanese, just hang on. You want to respond to the business about your degree? Do it briefly.
Oh, no, actually it was... I looked at different approaches. Zinc, cadmium and lead respond well to these sorts of incentives, and that was what I wrote about as an undergraduate, I think 24 years ago. What you've just done is fabricated something. Now, you can apologise.
Actually, the person who unequivocally said that a carbon tax would be a decent way of doing this was the Prime Minister, Tony Abbott.
Look, let me deal with something else that Anthony said. He talked about giving funds to polluters. There was a system which did that. The ALP's carbon tax was accompanied by $30 billion of payments to large firms, $5.5 billion including cash payments of $250 million each to Loy Yang, Hazelwood and your Lawn power stations, the dirtiest brown coal power stations in Australia, $9.2 billion to zinc, cadmium, steel, nickel, all of the major so-called polluters. Then you had another $300 million to steel in addition to everything else. Enormous flows of funds. We don't provide a dollar to anybody unless they actually reduce emissions.
What we're seeing under your policy right now, Greg, is brown coal increase in terms of its usage. We're seeing the renewable energy sector essentially flee from Australia.
False.
We are seeing that. Well, there's no reduction in the amount of activity from the renewable energy sector and investment in Australia.
Anthony Albanese, can I just pose a question to you just on this issue? I mean, they had a mandate to get rid of the carbon tax and they very clearly said they weren't going to have an emissions trading scheme, so the only policy they have left, the policy they went to the electorate with, is a direct action. Isn't it time to see whether that works? you can't possibly know yet because it hasn't even started.
We do know because it's simply, we can see the action already. Already we're seeing the fleeing of the renewable energy sector from Australia. Already we're seeing increased usage of brown coal in Australia. Already we are seeing a response whereby Australia is so embarrassed by its position, they don't want to debate climate change at the G20. I mean, the world wants to discuss climate change and to be engaged in it. Australia's gone from a leader to a pariah.
OK, Susan Greenfield wants to get in.
Yeah, and I should just say that obviously I've only been in the country 3 days and I'm not going to get deep and dirty into geopolitics, but as the gentleman said, I am the scientist, I'm the token scientist on the panel. And therefore, I'm just interested...
There's nothing token about you so far.
Thank you. What I'd like to ask the two politicians is how much are these decisions driven by the science and the science that you're finding, and how much by economic / financial / politics, for example, donations from, let's say, the coal industry, for example.
Actually, let's hear from other panellists before we go back to the politicians. James.
Well, direct action will lower the globe's temperature by about as much as Labor's carbon tax would have, which is to say not very much at all, because Australia makes up a very tiny proportion of the globe's emissions. On the positive side of direct action, it will certainly do less damage to the Australian economy than the carbon tax would have, and it does have the advantage that if the government does change its mind, it can be switched off relatively easily. On the negative side, though, I worry that it encourages business to think of government as a customer or a source of finance. Now, earlier this year, the Abbott government made, in my view, an excellent decision to refuse a bailout to Qantas. But Qantas has recently said that they'll be seeking funds through the Emissions Reduction Fund to buy a whole new fleet of planes that are more energy efficient. It will be quite ironic if the government refused a bailout for Qantas for jobs, but turned around and gave them a bailout for the environment. This is the kind of industrial-scale rent-seeking that these kinds of policies encourage, and that's very damaging.
Well, Greg had better respond to that.
Yeah,
Industrial-scale rent-seeking, that's from the IPA.
Well, the answer...
What do your enemies say about it?
Yes. Look, the answer is that what we're doing is investing in the lowest cost way to reduce emissions. And that means that whether it's cleaning up a coal-fired power station, whether it is energy efficiency on a grand scale, whether it's landscape change, we're doing just as we've done with water buybacks and purchasing the lowest cost emissions reductions. Remember, the carbon tax approach was to, instead of invest, to drive up the cost of electricity and gas in the hope that that would cause sufficient pain that either industry would flee to Indonesia or China or India, or that households would shiver through winter or swelter through summer. That's the philosophy of the carbon tax, drive up the price of electricity and gas to such a point as people are no longer able to use
OK, well, you
haven't
haven't responded to the issue there about Qantas. Is it possible they could use the Emissions Reduction Fund to buy a new fleet of planes?
Well, I think it would be exceptionally unlikely because that is likely to be an incredibly...
Do you rule it out?
I'm not ruling anything in or out because it's an old game, Tony.
It's a pretty obvious one, isn't it? Someone says something, you ask if it's true.
No. What we're doing is buying the lowest cost way to reduce emissions. And by the way, we're using the Carbon Farming Initiative, which Labor introduced and Labor apparently supports. So in other words, you can encourage the reduction of emissions on farms, in the landscape, the preservation of forests, the protection of vegetation, the reanimation of the soils with carbon.
These are points you made earlier. We're going to go to another question from Emma Muad'Din.
According to the Climate Institute, as a country, we should be aiming for a 40% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2025. However, we have actually stopped investing or lessened our investment by about 70% this year compared to a thriving US and China. Are we falling behind, and at what cost?
Well, let's start with Laura.
Well, Emma, I think there really is a concern that Australia is falling behind, particularly when it comes to renewable energy technologies. And I know that the overwhelming message that I've heard from young Australians this year is that we want urgent, meaningful action on climate change. And this isn't something that is just something that young Australians are saying. When I was at the United Nations, I was able to work with youth delegates from all around the world. And across the board, from young people in developing countries to young people in developed countries, we're saying that we really need urgent action on climate change. And we need the international community to come together. So something that I'm really hoping to see is Australia continue to engage really meaningfully in these UN negotiations. And part of that should be an increased investment in renewable energy.
Let's, Greg Hunt, the question there, and you mentioned it earlier, is about the targets. We know that most countries are going to announce their longer-term targets for emissions reduction in the lead-up to the Paris conference that you referred to. The British have already pretty much signed up to a 40% reduction in their emissions by 2030, 80% by 2050. What are Australia's targets?
Sure, look, obviously, as you say, in the lead-up to the Paris conference, which is at the end of 2015, we'll be talking publicly. We'll go through a process of discussion between now and then. It starts tomorrow, in fact. Australia is hosting an Asia-Pacific Rainforest Summit, working with countries from around the region in protecting the great forests of the region, which reduces emissions, it improves biodiversity and it protects local communities. Right here in Sydney, we are the international host of that, and that then flows onto the World Parks Congress. So do
you currently have even ballpark figures for the kind of targets that Australia will need to reach in 2030 and 2050,
sure,
which you're going to have to come up with around March or April next year?
Yeah, you can understand that I won't preempt my colleagues or suddenly announce them this evening. But what I can guarantee is that, firstly, we're doing our best to help play a leadership role with regard to the great forests and the protections. Secondly, to help develop some of the technology to reduce emissions from the existing power stations. And then thirdly,
on the question of targets, because it is the fundamental thing, isn't it, that all these countries are going to have to agree on set targets. So I guess what people want to know from you is, are you going to do that? Of course. First of all.
Of course.
And are they going to be substantially beyond the 5% reduction by 2020 that you're already committed to?
Well, we do want to see a good global agreement. We are part of that process. As I say, just tomorrow, we are helping to lead and to host and to bring together nations in a way which isn't just about the environment, it's also about reducing emissions.
But
so
can you even imagine Australia committing to what the British have committed to, which is 80% reduction by
I'm certainly not going to put a figure on it this evening. What I can say is that we are committed to a really good global agreement. I desperately, personally, deeply want to see that happen. It is important, and I think it's important to the planet, and it's important that we're part of it, and we will be part of it.
And so if the other major trading partners, the other big countries agree to an 80% reduction, for example, by 2050, and equivalent reductions to the EU, 40% by 2030, would you be agreeing to get on board with those kind of targets?
We will be part of a good global agreement, and we will make a real contribution to it. You're asking me to preempt our figures and our negotiating position, which understandably I won't do. But let me say this. I'm not a pessimist in this space. Susan is the scientist, but what I also see is immense scientific progress in terms of reduction of emissions, in storing of carbon in landscapes, in the ability to transform our industry. There is enormous scope for realistic optimism.
OK. Anthony Albanese wants to respond.
Well, I mean, Greg provides cover, comes here and talks about climate change and action as if something is actually happening. It's Orwellian. The fact is this is a government that is tearing down the structures. They would have gotten rid of the Climate Change Authority if they could have. They want to trash the renewable energy target.
Well, we're actually negotiating with you.
They're not Indeed, but they're negotiating from a basis of withdrawing from your previously agreed to position. From your previously agreed to position.
So can I just... hang on, there's a point that was just made there, and I think you probably do need to respond to it. Are you actually negotiating seriously to meet the government's requirement to bring down the renewable energy target from what it currently is?
We are negotiating seriously, but within our principles. It's not a blank check.
But what are your principles?
Not negotiating. Our principles are...
it was set at a certain level.
Our principles are this, Tony. We're not in government, and the renewable energy sector want certainty going forward. They want an agreement that's agreed to by the government and the opposition. We think the existing target of 41,000 is appropriate. That's our starting point.
Actually, it's not.
We would
publicly announced a different position.
We would agree with that. It is because they want. They want to negotiate and drive it down. Industry wants certainty, so we're prepared.
If they can only drive it down if you agree to drive it down.
Well, wait and see what happens, Tony. Wait and see what happens. But we won't be going in from a position of weakness. We won't be saying any agreement is better than none.
All right.
That is not what we'll be doing.
Susan Greenfield wants to get in. And can I just ask you, do you really believe that Britain will achieve the targets that it says it will achieve?
Well, I haven't got a crystal ball, but I applaud the government for doing that, and I'm glad that you cite us as and I've got here, I did some homework, and 15% by 2020 of renewables. And I think our government puts a premium on the science. We're very sensitive to the science and technology, and that's why I ask these politicians again, both of you, is there any conflict of interest at all, for example, with the coal industry or not? Is it purely science, or no one's answered this?
No,
Please answer me. I'm an outsider. I'm an outsider. I'm just innocently asking the question.
More than happy to take this on. We're already at 16% renewable energy in Australia. We're committed to the 20%. We'll achieve that 20%. That will see us, though, because of the way the renewable energy target is calculated, have probably a doubling of the small-scale solar and probably a 60% increase in what's known as the large-scale component of the renewable energy target. So we also share the science. We share the overall targets for the country. The disagreement here that you've sort of stumbled onto is one about the two different approaches, as I say, an electricity tax versus an
what about
incentives
conflict of
approach.
interest? I mean, as always, you know, this is something that one could say with mind change, you know, that the video game industry, a gazillion-dollar industry, you know, and of course they have an interest. And
well,
of course
let's see if Anthony Albanese thinks there's a conflict.
I'm just interested if there is.
No, I don't. I don't argue that drives their policy either. I think it's ideological. I think it's ideological, the difference between the two approaches. We believe it's one thing to be climate sceptics. They're market sceptics as well. I mean, they don't want... We believe you need to drive the change through the entire economy. And your best way to do that, the cheapest way to do that, is to let the market do it, not a command-style picking winners. And with regard to targets, the 5% was a minimum target, just like the 20% by 2020 was a minimum target as well. If we can do better, good. The 5%, we said, if the rest of the world acts, comparative countries acts, we'd be prepared to go to 15, and that's happening. The US has a target of 17% reduction based on 2005 levels. It is happening. We are falling behind and doing less than the US, less than Europe.
Of course, you do need to respond to that, but briefly, if you wouldn't mind, because we've got to move on.
When you actually start countries at the same point, if you start Australia and the US over the generation, the 30-year period that's under consideration from 1990 to 2020, the US and Australia are almost identical. So the US had a large rise in emissions and then a drop. Australia is almost at exactly the same emissions, only fractionally above where we are 25 years ago. So we've done a tremendous job, but we can do more going forward.
The starting point is very important here.
Yeah, so our effort with the United States is almost entirely comparable.
Okay. We spent 12 years avoiding signing up to Kyoto.
But we delivered we beat our targets by almost as much as any other country in the world.
Okay, I'm going to move on because we have other subjects to get to. I'm sorry to tell you that, those of you with your hands up, but we have a few other issues to deal with. This question is from Anthony Freckleton.
Yes, as Greg Hunt, given that the voting age was reduced to 18 because of the Vietnam War, the saying being that if you're old enough to kill, you're old enough to vote, should it now be looked at again and raised to 21, given that the 18-year-olds have had no life experiences? They're really just going to reflect the views of their teachers and their parents, and yet their voting outcome is obviously affected because you've got people voting. They might look the colour of your teeth or something. They have no real basis for voting.
All right, I'm not going to put that straight away to Greg Hunt. You can think about it, and we'll go to Laura.
Well, I mean, certainly...
What's to raise the voting age?
Certainly in my experience, I've met plenty of young Australians who are 18 or younger who are perfectly capable of voting and who I would suggest are probably more aware and have had more life experience than people double their age.
So the questioner asks, aren't they simply reflecting the ideas of their parents and teachers?
I don't think that's true. Certainly the young people I've met are able to think critically about the world in which they live in. But if the problem you're referring to is, I think, a broader issue of are Australians generally engaged with politics? Do we understand who we're voting for? And that's not an issue which is limited to a particular age. And if that's the problem, then I think what we really need to look at is the way in which our politicians engage with the entire Australian population, not just the young people.
James, what do you think?
Well, you do have to draw the line somewhere. I think 18 seems to be a reasonably logical point to draw the line where you can get a car and you can pay taxes and go to war. I'm much more concerned about the fact that voting is still compulsory in this country. I would like voting to be voluntary because a legitimate democratic expression is choosing not to vote as well as voting and voting for the party of your choice. So I'd like to see Australia follow most of the other democratic countries in the world and allow us to have voluntary voting.
So you'd prefer a system as in the United States where you might only get 60% of the population voting?
Or Germany or Sweden or Great Britain or New Zealand, these horrible democracies that, you know, are clearly not democratic anymore because it's voluntary.
Susan Greenfield?
Well, the thing that many of us applaud in Australia is the compulsory voting. When you live in a society where everyone's really apathetic, where, you know, if you want to make a protest, you could perhaps deface the ballot paper. You don't have to vote for some. If you want to, you go and make some kind of statement, but at least you're making a statement. People have died to get the vote. People chain themselves to railings to get the vote. Yeah? Women were force-fed to get the vote. And so don't knock it, you know, and I just really think that it's the absolute plank of a healthy democracy. I feel very strongly about this. And what's so interesting about the voting age is, as I'm sure many people are familiar with, the famous Scottish referendum that we had last September, where the voting age was reduced to 16. And again, the same kind of questions arose. At what age are you a responsible, accountable adult? At what stage are you just parroting the views of your parents? And I think the answer, as Laura said, is obviously you can have a very mature 16-year-old and you can have a completely immature 30-year-old. Yeah? So I'm afraid that's what democracy is. And I would agree with James there that you have to have some arbitrary age. And why not have the age when you can die for your country? It seems a good one to me.
So in spite of your view that a lot of young people are immature, self-obsessed, narcissistic, you still think they should get the vote?
I think really everyone should be over 50 if they vote. No, of course. No, my answer is let's shape a society where we help bring out the best in people, develop them in their full potential, you know, realise their talents, develop a strong sense of who they are. That's what we need to do.
Anthony Albanese.
I think often, unfortunately, a lot of the people who argue for voluntary voting are the same people who, like in the United States, go out of their way to keep people off the roll and make it difficult for people to vote. I think compulsory voting is very important. It means that you can actually debate the issues and don't have to worry about, you know, the get out the vote, which is the obsession. You win elections in many countries by getting people to vote rather than what they vote for and the issues. And the truth is that, you know, you cop results in this country and, you know, I think... you know, unfortunately, we didn't win the last election, but you cop it because you know that everyone got their say on polling day.
You know, we started with a question about whether the voting age should be increased. Do you want to reflect on that, or do you think it
certainly shouldn't? I think it's pretty obvious that it shouldn't be.
Should it be decreased, as in Scotland?
Well, I think there's an argument that 18-year-olds should certainly have a right to vote more so than anyone else, maybe, because after all, Laura and James are going to be on the planet longer than me and Greg are, or you yourself, Tony, and even Susan. So they're going to be impacted more by the decisions that governments make, and I think young people are amongst the most engaged people.
Greg Hunt.
Look, obviously I respect the question, but I disagree. I think that people who are 18, 19 and 20 are full of life and ideas and there's no question that some will have an influence from their parents, but these are some of the most vibrant minds in our society, and it's an age which reflects the end of school, an age which reflects the ability to drive, to drink and to fight for your country. So I wouldn't change that. And look, I think Anthony and I are on a unity ticket that we avoid, by having compulsory voting, we won't say that very often, by having compulsory voting, it's a small democratic irony, but it makes it one of the healthiest features of our democracy, that we're not fighting about getting out the vote, we're not playing the American game. We are able to debate issues perhaps robustly, but perhaps more accurately and in a more focused way than other countries.
And thank you for allowing us to have that debate, James. Anytime. We'll just go to another subject and we'll see if the Unity ticket holds on this one. Janet Dandy Ward.
OK, my question's for Anthony Albanese. I live in St Peters, Sydney, where homes in your electorate are about to be destroyed to make way for roads that support a multi-billion-dollar WestConnex motorway project. This motorway will devastate communities throughout Sydney, much as the east-west link is set to do in Melbourne. Why do governments inject huge amounts of money into these projects, claiming the end result will ease traffic congestion, when all the evidence shows building bigger roads is not the solution?
Anthony Albanese, you can start us off on this.
Well, I think that we need roads and we need railways, though, and that the federal government, one of the big differences, big distinctions in federal politics now is we funded public transport projects more than all previous governments combined, from Federation through to 2007. They won't, and they've made that clear. I think that the investment, though, should be driven by productivity. What's the best method? You can't have... a city only functions if you move people and freight on all modes. And I think with regard to WestConnex at the moment, the proposal that suggests that traffic should come out at St Peters is a road to a traffic jam. That does not make sense. I think that the M5 needs to have a direct connection, though, through to the port, just as the M4 needs to be able to move people to the city. People in Western Sydney and South West Sydney deserve to have that access as well. I think where the M4 stops at the moment doesn't make any sense. But I am concerned about the WestConnex project. I certainly don't think that funneling traffic onto, for those people who know Sydney in this audience, national audience, funneling traffic into what is the most congested area of Sydney just to the west of the airport does not make any sense. And I've asked for a briefing. I've written. The New South Wales Minister chose to give that correspondence to the Telegraph and make it public. But I want to see effective infrastructure investment. So I don't agree in opposing all road investment.
Okay, can I just say, it's a national program, as you say. The questioner mentioned Victoria, the east-west link. Now, the Labor leader down there, who might well be the Premier after the next election, who knows, says he'll scrap the east-west road link, put the money into Melbourne Metro Rail, I think it is.
Well, Melbourne Metro, we spent $40 million on a proper study. It shows that it had the recommendation of Infrastructure Australia. The government has taken money off public transport projects like Melbourne Metro, Cross River Rail in Brisbane and put it into roads.
But do you think it's a good idea for him to scrap a project which is so far down the track?
Well, it isn't down the track, Tony. Nothing's happened. All they've done
that is down the track. That's the definition of down the track.
What they have done, this government, with this so-called budget emergency, is give a $1.5 billion advance payment to the Victorian government in the last financial year. It's already been given. For stage 2 of this project isn't due to commence until at least 2016-17. It doesn't make any sense. Governments need to...
So I'm going to have to get you to wind up so we can hear from Greg Hunt.
You need to have... to deal with urban congestion, you need public transport. It's as simple as that.
Now, Greg Hunt, is there a philosophical debate here now between rail and roads? You're a government that believes heavily in roads. I'm not sure if this is true or not, but you don't seem to believe in rail to the same degree. Tell us if there is a philosophical divide.
No, I think this is a false debate. What we've done is we inherited about $29 billion, I think, from your pre-election economic forecasts. That's the figure for transport and infrastructure that was there in terms of capital injections. 29 billion was the figure. Our budget figure was 40 billion plus 5 billion for asset recycling and 5 billion beyond the budget. The asset recycling right now is being looked at as the basis for investing in a second cross-Sydney Harbour tunnel for rail. It's being looked at in terms of a rail project from Tullamarine to Melbourne City. And in terms of the East-West link, which for Victorians is a profoundly important project, you've really got two principles. You're thinking in the 30 and the 50 and the 100 years in the same way that building the harbour bridge, building the tunnel under the harbour, building the Domain or Burnley Tunnel in Melbourne was profoundly important. This project is about allowing people to be more productive, not spend all their time on the roads. It improves the environment by not having people idling, just sitting there on the Eastern Freeway or in the suburbs of Collingwood and Carlton and through the centre of Melbourne. So it has
do you or do you not
environmental
believe
and a
equally
community
in
effect.
public transport? Because
Sure, of course
so
we-
it goes down to the issue of, well, for example, whether the Prime Minister's off-stated comments about a humble man being king in his car, and his equally off-stated comments in battle lines suggesting that public transport is not a really great way to spend money because it's dominated by the unions.
No, I don't think that's a fair representation.
Yes, it is.
I don't think that's a fair representation.
It is a pretty fair representation.
We've got at the moment, as I say, the states are looking immediately at the Asset Recycling Fund for a second rail tunnel in terms of Sydney. I mentioned the Tullamarine to Melbourne rail project. What we see is because of the money, the $3 billion all up, which is going into East-West Link in Melbourne, that's allowed the state to be able to invest $3.9 billion announced on the weekend with regards to rolling stock and rail. So if you're providing money for transport, it can be both direct for rail or it can open up the space for rail. And you need both.
Except, with due respect to Greg, the Asset Recycling Fund is itself recycled. It's money that was taken from the Building Australia Fund that was already in the budget for public transport and been renamed, the $5 billion renamed, Asset Recycling Fund. It's not any new money. There's no new money here. We asked questions on notice about...
keep it brief because we've got one more question to get to. We're nearly out of time.
The government cut every single dollar for public transport that wasn't already under construction in the budget. It's as simple as that.
OK, the next question is our final question. It's from Robin Alexander.
Thank you. My question is for Susan. You have described the mind as the tailored brain. Given that, how have the brains of Conservatives been tailored differently from those of Progressives?
I'll come to Susan last. I want to hear brief answers from everybody. James, how was your... how did you become a Conservative?
I guess I'm not very well placed to judge. I gather by the tone of the question there's something defective with my brain, so I'm probably not very capable of
I'm not sure.
it. But in all seriousness, this is a really interesting area of study. Jonathan Haidt wrote a book about this a couple of years ago, which found that one of the reasons why Progressives and Conservatives, for want of a better term, don't connect and don't always line up and can't communicate with each other is that they have very different value bases. They think about things from a very different point of view. And so sometimes we'll say people on the opposite side of the ideological divide and can't understand why they have the position they do and just assume they must be badly motivated. It must be because they're being donated to by coal companies, for example. But the truth is actually we just approach things from a different values perspective, and that's kind of hardwired in us.
Laura.
Well, I think I'm probably a progressive, so I hope I'm on the right side of your question there. I think it really is a very interesting
How did you
area.
end up as a progressive? Was it nature or nurture?
I don't know, I have to ask my mum and dad in the audience. I like to think it's a little bit of both, really. But I think that James raises an important point, which is that regardless of where we sit on this ideological divide, we need to communicate with each other. And we need to communicate with each other so we can actually combat these challenges that we face. So I'm really glad that we've been able to have this conversation from opposite sides of the divide with Tony in the middle as our mediator.
Let's hear from Greg Hunt. Do you actually regard yourself as a Conservative or a progressive?
Look, on social issues, I would regard myself as being liberal. I believe in freedoms immensely, just a deep, passionate belief in freedoms as a basis for the way in which we go around our lives. In terms of defence and economics, I'd regard myself as being what you would call conservative, very clearly in terms of balancing the budget, not leaving a debt to the next generation and being realistic about the threats. If you ask me for the biggest single influence, probably my father. I grew up as the son of a planning minister, and he was always thinking in terms of the generation and the half century and the century. and trying to frame things outside of the political, but in terms of the long term. And that has had an influence and has perhaps been the biggest influence in my life.
Anthony Albanese.
Well, Tony, I was raised with three great faiths, the Catholic Church, the Australian Labor Party and South Sydney Football Club. Souths are doing better than the other two at the moment. And, but,
have you ever harboured any conservative ideas?
Well, I have. I, on economic policy, am very much a market-oriented economist. I believe that markets can be democratic mechanisms. That's why I support an emissions trading scheme rather than the Stalinist command style of Greg Hunt.
All right, now we'll leave it there because we're out of time. Susan.
I did well to work in climate change.
Well,
I don't know how you manage that.
OK, the brain is not hardwired. That's the whole point. If you're a goldfish, you'd have a hardwired brain, but we're not goldfish. We're human beings, which means we're infinitely adaptable. And you can send kids away for 5 days, as a recent experiment has done, and they increase their interpersonal skills in 5 days. What I'd like to conclude, though, in the science is a wonderful quote from Michael Faraday. There's nothing quite as frightening as somebody who knows they're right. So long live debate.
I thought you were quite scary. That's all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel, Baroness Susan Greenfield, Anthony Albanese, James Paterson, Laura John and Greg Hunt. Thank you. Next week, thank you. Next week on Q&A, with the government's decision on ABC funding imminent, we're joined by the Minister for Communications, Malcolm Turnbull, the Deputy Opposition Leader, Tanya Plibersek, former Media Watch host, Jonathan Holmes, Daily Telegraph opinion editor, Sarah Lemarquand, and comedian and author, Ben Elton. So until next week's Q&A, good night.